I'm Paul Nadeau. I'm a keynote speaker, and I have stories. My keynotes are about negotiations, how to negotiate in business and in life. I also speak on mental wellness, and I speak on conflict resolution. I'm going to tell you a story. I was on the job for about 2 years. I was a patrol officer, and I was pretty new to the experience of being a cop, but I was learning as I was going. Two of the greatest lessons that I ever learned in my career were these, and I learned these earlier on. Number one, we are more similar than we are different. Now let that sink in for just a moment. We are more similar than we are different. How did that help out as a police officer? It helped out because I could imagine what it would be like to stand in front of a police officer who's asking you to do something or giving you certain instructions. I could imagine what it would be like to be a detective speaking to a victim of crime, how my empathy could play a major role in getting a person to open up or getting a person to trust me. So one of the greatest lessons I learned is we're more similar than we are different. We all laugh, love, and bleed in the same way. It really applies to every aspect of life. The second one is that you get what you give, meaning that if I give you dignity and respect, I'm likely to get dignity and respect in return. However, the same is true. If I give you the finger, if I tell you to go mess yourself up or do whatever, you're likely to give me the same in return, and not only that, you're likely to give me a heck of a lot more. So you get what you give. Now let's keep that in mind. 2 years on the job, it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I got a 911 call. Now, I was in a uniform patrol car. I had my police uniform on, and I live in Canada, and it was October. And in this particular month, this October month, 2 years on the job, it was cold that night. I had a jacket on, I had a sweater on, the heat was on in my police cruiser. 2 o'clock in the morning, very, very quiet night. Up until now, I get a 911 call from an ambulance that were asking for help because they had just been assaulted by someone in a high-rise, low-income neighborhood, and they were calling for help. And I picked up the radio, and I announced myself to the dispatcher. My call sign was 1712. And I picked up the radio and I said, 1712 to control, I'm in the neighborhood, I'll respond to that. No other police officer picked up their radio to say that they were coming to back me up, but that was okay. Way back when, we didn't have too many calls, and I would imagine that a few of the cops were trying to get a little bit of shut-eye. It doesn't matter. I was going to go and I was going to do my very, very best. So I drove into the neighborhood, 2 o'clock in the morning, cold October. I've set the scene. So when I pulled into the neighborhood, I noticed the ambulance off to the distance, about 35 feet away from where I was. So I pulled my cruiser over to the side of the road and I parked there. I didn't want to drive up to the ambulance not knowing exactly what was going on or what to expect. I didn't know if it was an ambush. I didn't know what the scenario was. So I parked a fair distance and a safe distance away. I got out of my police car and I closed the door very quietly. Now, I had my police uniform. I even put my hat on because we had to wear our hats way back when. And I started to move cautiously and carefully towards the ambulance and the ambulance attendants. I noticed that the ambulance attendants were on the ground, and both of them were holding their head and they were wiping themselves, and I could see that one of them was bleeding. And as I was walking up, I heard it. I heard the sound of someone screaming. And when I looked over to the distance, in the background, about 25 feet away from where I was this Hulk of a man. He was about 6'1", 6'2", and he was built like Thor. Great big muscles on him. He had long blonde hair, like scraggly hair, and he was howling at the moon. He was really howling at the moon with his fists clenched. He was yelling. One thing I noticed about this guy too was that on this cold October night, he wasn't wearing anything but white underwear. That's all he was wearing, tighty whities. And I looked over at him, and he looked mean and menacing. But I continued to walk towards the ambulance attendants, and when I got within a safe distance from them, just a few feet from them, I said, "Are you guys all right?" And they said, "No, we got assaulted by this guy." You're on your own. He wants to go to the hospital. He's suffering, and we're not taking him. That's Jimmy Donovan, and you want to be leaving. You want to be calling for backup, but we're out of here. And they jump in their ambulance, and they start to leave. And I said, wait a minute, who is this guy? And they said, we already gave you his name, but you'd better call for backup because he's one of the meanest guys we've ever dealt with. I come to find out that this man, Jimmy, was one of the most violent criminals we had ever had in our jurisdiction. This guy did some hard time in the Kingston Penitentiary, which is a penitentiary in Ontario for hardened criminals, and he was doing some serious time for manslaughter. In fact, Jimmy was on a kill squad. What had happened in the Kingston Penitentiary when he was there is that a number of the inmates had taken some security personnel hostage, and Jimmy was on the kill squad, meaning that Jimmy would kill the security people, he would kill the guards if their demands were not met. And that's the type of person that Jimmy was. He had a record for armed robbery. He had a record for violent assaults. He had a record for all kinds of things. And you know what he liked? He liked to beat up on cops. And it usually took about 6 or 7 cops to get Jimmy on the ground. He just loved to beat on police officers. And that was the man that I saw howling at the moon in his tighty whities. And now the ambulance was leaving, and I was standing there a good 30 feet away from my car with a deranged man howling at the moon in obvious distress. And I thought to myself, what do I do? My training had not prepared me for this. And I thought to myself in a few moments, I thought, you know, the best thing to do, Paul, is to get to your car, get in your car, close and lock the door, and wait for backup. There's no way you're going to handle this man. He's 6'1". He outweighs you by about 50 pounds. He's muscular and he's dangerous. So I started to walk towards my cruiser. But I don't know about you. When we have these great plans in our head, sometimes they don't always work out the way that we want, right? I'm talking to you. Sometimes your best made plans don't work out. Well, that's what happened to me on that morning. I was about 15 or so feet away from my car when all of a sudden my portable radio, the one that I had on my hip, just squelched, and it was the dispatcher that said, "This is the dispatch, everything 10-4, 17-12." And it echoed through that neighborhood like a loudspeaker. And I had forgotten to turn down my radio. I was new on the job, 2 years. I should have known better, but I didn't. And I didn't turn it off, and I immediately looked over at this hulk of a man who was howling at the moon, and then all of a sudden, he switched his gaze over, and he looked at me, and he went into one of these incredible Hulk positions. And he looked at me as though he were going to tear me apart. I'm 15 feet away from my car, and I'm thinking to myself very quickly, how do I get out of here? Do I run for my car? And I thought better of it. He's not that far away from me. By the time I got to the door, I would not be able to open it, get into that car safely. He'd be on top of me, and I would be his breakfast. And so I immediately just thought about it for a moment and put up my hands like this. And I said, "You look like you're cold. There's a blanket in the back of my car. Why don't I get you the blanket, and you can come with me. I'll take you to the hospital." Now, I don't know where that came from. I don't know where that came from, but it just came out of me. And so what I did was I walked very cautiously towards the car while I was looking at him, and he followed. I opened the trunk and I took out the blanket and I put it around him. And I did what I said. I walked over to the passenger seat, I opened the door, and I took out my briefcase, which was on the passenger seat, and I put it in the back. And I had Jimmy sit in the front with me. Now just think about that for a moment. One of the most hardened criminals of our time in our city was now sitting in the front of a police cruiser next to a junior cop. And you may call that crazy. Looking back at it, it probably was, but also looking back at it, it probably was the best thing I possibly could have done. because Jimmy had never spent any time in the front of a police cruiser. He'd always spent time in the back behind a cage. Now I had him in the front, and I was taking him to the hospital. Jimmy got into the car and closed the door. I got in and closed the door, and the heat that I had coming out of the heater hit him. Jimmy put his head down, and he started to cry. He started to cry. And I was amazed. I didn't know what to say or how to respond to that. And I merely picked up my radio and I said, "This is 1712 to control. I'm taking Jimmy Donovan to the hospital, to the Oshawa General Hospital." And at that moment, the radio broke off. So many guys were jumping on the radio, trying to get their messages in, telling me, "He's dangerous, he's crazy, you're crazy, we'll be there, we're backing you up." All that kind of stuff, just a mix of different messages, to the point where I turned the radio completely down so that Jimmy wouldn't hear it. So I drove to the hospital, and by the time we got to the hospital, the ambulance was there, but the people, the staff, the emergency staff, had set a room to the side for us, an examination room, because they knew who Jimmy was, and they wanted us away from the general population. So Jimmy and I got into the examination room, and he sat down on a bench with the blanket over him, and Jimmy and I started to talk. Just a conversation, just talking about nothing. Just, who are you, and all this kind of stuff. I didn't know who he was, and he didn't know who I was, and we were just spending some time waiting for the doctor, having a pleasant conversation. About 3 or 4 minutes go by when we're just sitting there talking about nothing and getting to know each other. Then all of a sudden the door opens. The examination door, the room, that door opens, and 4 cops, I'm not kidding guys, 4 cops tried to squeeze in through that door at the same time. One of them had his pistol out. One of them had his nightstick out, and the other 2 were just trying to get in. Every one of those cops was trying to get in, and I imagine they were trying to get in to get a piece out of Jimmy, who had probably beaten them up in the past. And they're jumping in. Jimmy is sitting there, all quiet, having a good time up until now, and I'm in the middle. Suddenly, Jimmy jumps up, throws the blanket off, gets into his incredible Hulk stance, starts to show his teeth, and I gotta say, he only had 1 or 2 teeth. Most of his teeth had been ripped out of his face. He had lost his teeth in fights. He had scars all over his face. He wasn't a pretty man, but he was a big man. And now he was ready to fight the cops who were on my other side. And I'm right in the middle of this thing. I'm all of 160 pounds with my uniform on, and I'm in the middle of this war. And the first thing that came to mind was I immediately put my hand up. I pointed it at the cops that were at the door, and I said, "You guys, get the hell out of here. If I need you, I will call you. You will hear me screaming, and until then, you don't come in." And I pointed at Jimmy, and I said, "Jimmy, sit down." Well, the cops left. Jimmy sat down. I sat down. And after a moment, I collected myself, and Jimmy and I continued to talk. About half an hour later, the doctor comes in, gave Jimmy a shot of something, and said it was time for us to go. Everything was fine. And by now, it was after 3 in the morning. It was probably around 3:15. And I told Jimmy I would give him a ride home. And he jumps in the front with me. And now we're talking as though we had known each other for quite a while. There was no hostility between the 2 of us. I'm a cop, he's a criminal. That didn't play there. And the reason it didn't play there is because I didn't treat him like a criminal, and he didn't treat me like the cops he hated. He just treated me like a person. That's important when we're resolving conflict, is just to treat each other with respect. So as we're driving back to his home, he says to me, he says, "You know what, Paul? You are the nicest cop I've ever met." I said, "Oh, thank you, Jimmy. You're not bad yourself." And I was going to church at the time. And I pulled out a small religious tract that I had with me, and I wrote my telephone number down on it, and I said, "Jimmy, if ever at some point you'd like to go to church, I'd be happy to take you." I don't know where that came either. I don't know where that came from, but I left him with my phone number, and he said, "Well, I'll think about it." And as we pulled into his condominium, he asked me if I wanted to go see meet his fiancée. And I'm thinking to myself, I've got a couple more hours left on my shift. What else am I going to do? And I thought, sure, why not? And I said, sure, I'd like that. Now, I got to admit, I'm imagining to myself that she was probably not all that great looking. I mean, I'm looking at Jimmy, this big guy, missing most of his teeth, scars all over his face, scraggly hair. I think he was once a good-looking man, but he certainly wasn't that now. And I'm imagining what she was looking like. And I don't know why I thought there. I thought it'll be amusing. Well, when we got up to his floor, just outside his door, the door opened, and out stepped this beautiful young woman wearing a floral dress, a beautiful floral dress. And I still remember that dress and her smile to this day. And in a very gentle and welcoming voice, she said, "Thank you, officer, for bringing my Jimmy home." That was a moment that really impacted me. I judged the person that he would be associating with. I had no idea, and I learned from that. We don't judge people just simply by their covers. Now, he had a bad cover, yes, but the person that was with him did not. And she was just a lovely person. And I said, "You're very welcome," and I left. And I never thought anything more of it. That was my encounter with Jimmy until about 2 weeks later. 2 weeks later, the sergeant comes up to me on one of my shifts and says, "Hey, there's a phone number here. A young woman wants you to give her a call." And I said, "Okay, that's fine." So before I went out to do my shift, I called the number, and it turned out to be Jimmy's fiancée. And Jimmy's fiancée said, "Jimmy and I would like to go to church. Would you pick us up?" I thought, "Yes, of course I will." And so I drove out to Jimmy's place Sunday morning, wearing my Sunday best, and out comes Jimmy and his fiancée. Now, his fiancée looked marvelous. She was wearing this beautiful dress, and she had the smile again. She was just radiant. And Jimmy, well, he was radiant too. He had this three-piece, old, tattered suit, but he had a smile on his face, his hair was washed, and he looked incredible. And he jumped in my car as she did, and the three of us drove out to the church. Now you can imagine this. My coppers, who may have seen us driving to church, were looking at me with one of the most hardened criminals in my car. And the hardened criminals who were looking at Jimmy thought the same. He's with a cop. So you can imagine what everybody was thinking about us being together, but that didn't matter. When we got to the church, the pastor greeted us, said hello, welcome. He knew me. I'd been a member of that church for a few years. Everybody liked me. I used to gather after the church. We would spend time talking with just different people from the congregation. And now the pastor was welcoming Jimmy and his fiancée, and he was just a magnificent man, and they felt welcomed, and it was beautiful. And we went into church, and we sat together, and we listened to the good word. And the good word was about loving thy neighbor and really to be the best people that we possibly can. If you're a churchgoer, ever been to church or heard a sermon, you know what it's like. And after the sermon, after the church experience, I stood out there with Jimmy and his fiancée, waiting for my friends to come up and welcome Jimmy and say hi and welcome to the church. And that didn't happen. Not one person came up to us, not one. They looked at me, they looked at Jimmy, and they walked away. These were my friends. Every week they would come up to me and say, "Hey, Paul, how's it going?" But not one of them came up that week. We spent about 15 minutes, and then I drove Jimmy and his fiancée home, and we planned to meet on the next Sunday, which we did. I picked them up. Jimmy was looking great. His fiancée was looking spectacular. Drove to the church. The pastor was beautiful. He remembered their names. He made them feel so welcomed. We went, we listened to the good word. After church, we stood there, and nobody came. And Jimmy and his fiancée got to meet no one new. I took them home. Third week, Jimmy had a smile on his face. It wasn't as big. We went to church, the same thing. Nobody came to us. And this lasted for one more week, and Jimmy had lost his smile. He got into the car on the fourth week, a little reluctant to go. His fiancée still had a smile, but when we got there, The pastor greeted us warmly and beautifully, and after church, nobody showed up. And when I dropped him and his fiancée off, he told me he was not coming back. And I said, I understand, Jim. I really do. And I'm sorry. I'm sorry. That story really hit me because I know that we hear these great messages of love and hope, and we want to see it actually happen. When we hear a good message, we want to see people carrying that message. And I understand that not everybody, people were afraid. They were afraid to come up to him. They had heard his reputation, but they weren't willing to be open to maybe the experience of welcoming somebody new into the congregation. I'm not faulting them. Like, everybody is different, but I thought at least one person would do that. And not everybody is perfect, and that's okay. And that's, I suppose, why we listen to these wonderful messages, to make ourselves that much better. Jimmy decided after a few months that he was moving to the west coast of Canada, and I was not going to see him anymore, and so I said my farewells and off he went. I have to say this, that while Jimmy was in our jurisdiction after his church experience and getting to know me, I had dropped in to see him a few times. We had coffee. We had become friends. And he wasn't the criminal that he once was. He had dropped his criminal activity while he was with us for those several months after the church experience. So now he moved to Vancouver, didn't hear from him, and about 2 years later, during parade, I heard that it was a midnight shift, and our staff sergeant showed up, and he said, anybody remember Jimmy Donovan? And I said, yeah, and everybody else did. And they said, well, we don't have to worry about that guy anymore. He died last night in a gun battle. He's dead. Don't have to worry about him. That was my friend. And my friend died in a gun battle with the police. He made his decision not to follow the right path, but he was still my friend. And that story still really pulls at my heartstrings whenever I hear it, because we all had an opportunity to make the world a better place. And I think it would have been a better place had Jimmy found a new home. And that's my Jimmy story. Thanks for listening.